Welcome back. All right, so in honor of the Boston Bruins setting the records they have, I figured as a Bruins fan, wearing my Cam Neely jersey or sweater, whatever you'd like to call it, I figured why not talk about the Bruins and why I've been tempered in my expectations. And there's been questions of why isn't he all excited? Is he a Bruins fan or not? Why isn't he excited? Because it feels like to me as a Bruins fan, I've seen this storyline before. Now this is different. This is 133 points. It's an all-time record, and there's still a game left where they can push that record even further. You know, hit 135 points and 65 wins, and all of that is great. But this coming Monday, everything resets. We have best of seven series. We still do not know who Boston's playing. Could be the Islanders. Could be Florida. Could be Pittsburgh. In terms of matchups with Boston, I think all three teams would form their own challenges. I think that with Pittsburgh, you have to look at the Crosby Malkin effect in the playoffs. Pittsburgh also hasn't been out of the first round in a while, so you have the hunger argument there too. On the Florida front, this is a team that's fallen from President's Trophy winner to barely being a wild card team, and they're going to have something to prove come playoff time. They might be better built for playoffs this year than they have been in previous seasons. And then with the Islanders, you have the Sorokin impact. The fact that Sorokin could absolutely steal one of the first two games in Boston, which then just sets everything on its ear because then you have to go to New York and play the Islanders at UBS, which is going to be loud. And so, yeah, I think with all three series, should Boston win them? Yes. But the idea of, oh, they'll definitely win it and they're going to crush everybody. I found a post on my own Facebook account from 2014 from today how excited I was that Boston was winning the President's Trophy and how excited I was for a potential Stanley Cup. And that was coming off of 2013. They had gone all the way to the final, and in 2011, they'd won the Stanley Cup. So I was still riding that wave of really, really high optimism when it came to the Boston Bruins, and they were going to have home ice advantage throughout the playoffs. They should be able to get this done. However, when we look at their playoff history, finishing first doesn't necessarily mean a lot's going to happen in their favor. Now, this is their fourth time winning the President's Trophy. The most recent, 2019-2020, they lost in the second round against Tampa Bay in 2020. 2013-2014, as mentioned, President's Trophy, they lose in round two against Montreal. 2011-2012, they win their division. They lost in the first round against Washington. That was a tough one. I remember that series because I had been pretty concerned going into it that I thought, Boston won the cup and back to back is tough to do. In Washington, that could be a tough out. And sure enough, they knocked off Boston. 2010, 2011, they win the Stanley Cup. They also won the division that year. And Vancouver was the victim of the Boston Bruins in the final that year. And so, again, for me, I was cheering for Vancouver in that Stanley Cup final. It was tough. 2008, 2009, they win their division that year. They lost in the second round. That was against Carolina. So Carolina, on one of their runs to the conference final, that was a rule for a long time with Carolina. You miss the playoffs or you at least go to the conference finals. There didn't seem to be an in-between. 2003, 2004, they lost in the first round when they won the division that year against Montreal. 2001, 2002, they win their division. They lose in the first round against Montreal. This is why when people say, I don't know why he says Boston-Montreal is a bad matchup for Boston, I realize that it's been a while since I did the historical videos. Might be time to bring some of those back. I have watched Montreal teams knock out Boston teams a lot. So 92-93, in the first round, they get knocked out, even though they won the division that year, by Buffalo. Buffalo went on quite the run after that. But really, again, for Boston, that was one of those. They won the division. Things look good. Keep in mind that in 91 and 92, they lost in the conference final, so I was excited in 93, and then down they go. 90-91, they won the division. They lost in the conference final against Pittsburgh. The last time this guy boasted about Boston was 1991. And I mean boasted as in, going to win the cup. It's going to happen. It's time. And nope. 89-90, they won the President's Trophy that year. They lost against the Oilers in the Stanley Cup final. And once that final got started, it was clear the Oilers were going to win it. And they did, as they had 2 years previous as well against the Boston Bruins. 83-84, Boston wins their division. They lose in the first round against Montreal, because Montreal-Boston's a bad matchup for Boston. 82-83, which is one of the first years I was watching hockey. They won their division. They lost in the conference final against the New York Islanders. They were also first in the National Hockey League. We did not have a President's Trophy at that point. So this is the 5th time since I've started watching hockey that Boston will have finished first in the NHL. And in the previous 4, they have not won a championship. They have a Stanley Cup final, a conference final, and most recently 2 second-round exits. And it again, I know the number of points is ridiculous, and it has been so much fun to watch, but it resets to 0 on Monday. Actually, on Saturday, it resets to 0, really. And that's the trick. Now, 76-77, the Montreal Canadiens won that Stanley Cup. They had the 132 points. They won against Boston in 4. I wish I was making this up. They had 9 Hall of Famers. 9 Hall of Famers on that Montreal team. So when people talk about the Habs and how good that team was, it was. But by today's standards, with a salary cap, there's no way you keep that team together. 95-96, the Detroit Red Wings, 131 points. They lost in the conference final in 6 against the Colorado Avalanche that year. It was a great series, too. And then, of course, they won the championship a couple years after. 77-78, the Montreal Canadiens had 129 points. They won the Stanley Cup in 6 against Boston. So I'm very grateful Montreal's missed the playoffs this year because, 129 points and beats Boston in the Cup final. 2018-2019, the most recent on the board, not named Boston, Tampa Bay, the Bolts, 128 points. They, of course, lost in the first round, and it was a sweep at the hands of the Columbus Blue Jackets. And going into that series, I said Columbus are dead. It was a joke, but it went kind of viral. Ended up on a Columbus Blue Jackets video when they were promoting their second-round matchup, because that was the consensus. Nobody was taking Columbus to knock off Tampa. Tampa was a machine. 62 wins, 128 points. Nobody's knocking them out in the first round. And then they did. And not only did they get knocked out by Columbus, they kind of got schooled by Columbus. It was a series that I don't even know how close that was. Tampa Bay just didn't look like they were in it. 75-76, the Habs, 127 points for them. So there you go, 75-76, 76-77, and 77-78. 3 of the top 5 beneath Boston, so 3 of the top 6 overall. Montreal, they won the Stanley Cup that year in 4 straight over Philly. So there's a couple ways to look at this. Of the top 6 teams in points all time in a season, 3 of them have won the Stanley Cup. But they were all Montreal. And Montreal in the playoffs they faced in the mid-70s, a little different than what a team faces now. The ability of one team to neutralize another is much stronger than what it was in the 70s or the 80s. I do wonder if 80s coaches and 80s teams had the kind of video surveillance you have of players now, where everything they do on the ice, you have video of it, how that would have affected scoring in the league, how that would have affected records as well, and if that might have evened out the playing field a little bit, having all that information that we just didn't have back then. 2022-2023 has been quite the year for Boston. Now, their power play, I've heard concerns about. They're currently 11th overall in power play. Now, the last time they won the Stanley Cup in 2011, there was not much of a power play to speak of with Boston. So I don't really have a concern with the power play, because 5-on-5 and especially 4-on-4, they're quite good. Their penalty kill is number 1. That's important. Their shots against, they're at 8th per game. According to the NHL's stats, they're 8th currently in shots against per game. Pasternak's 60 goals are second only to Connor McDavid. And then there's the remarkable season that Ullmark has had, which kind of reminds me of Pete Peters, a little bit with Andy Moog, but more Pete Peters than Andy Moog. And then, of course, you have Tuukka Rask is in that conversation as well. As a goaltender, had some really good seasons, right? But for Ullmark, he has a 1.89 goals against average. That's first. Gustafsson's number 2 at 2.05 in Minnesota. Save percentage, 938 for Ullmark. That's number 1. Number 2 is Gustafsson again. He's number 2 with a 933. And the 40 wins for Ullmark, the fastest goaltender to 40 wins. Took the fewest amount of starts in league history. Georgiev's number 2 in the league with 38. So they haven't overplayed Ullmark. And I think that's important. They've played Swayman enough that Ullmark should be well rested and in pretty good shape for the playoffs. but he doesn't really have a playoff resume. We don't know how things are going to go in a best of 7 series and whether or not a team in, say, game 2 or game 3 might say, hey, wait a minute. He's kind of weak on the blocker side right now, or maybe it's we go high glove side. He's letting those ones in. A team can figure out a goaltender during a 7-game series, and it can really turn things quickly. It's something that got focused on a lot with Calgary against Edmonton. Edmonton just knows how to beat Markstrom, right? And so that was a major problem, and it definitely played a role in Calgary getting knocked out. Whereas Markstrom had a really solid regular season, in the playoffs things were a little different. So it is not a case of me downplaying my own excitement. It's just a case of me tempering expectation. It's Jim Montgomery's first year in Boston, and after the way that he exited from Dallas as he did, I think it's great that he's got this redemption arc going. I think it's been fantastic. We look at the recent playoff history. Last year they lost in the first round against Carolina in 7. Previous year they lost in 6 in the second round against the Islanders. 2020 they lost in the second round against Tampa in 5. 2019, of course, they got all the way to the Stanley Cup final. They lost in 7 against St. Louis. You guys were this close to the happy dance on screen. 2018, they lost in round 2 again against Tampa, again in 5 games. And 2017, they lost in the first round in 6 against Ottawa. 2015 and 2016, the 2 years prior, they did not make the playoffs. So for Boston, it feels like this might be their best chance, and I think it is their best chance at potentially winning a championship. This could be the last hurrah for Bergeron, for Krejci as well. And so there's definitely something big feeling about this season anyways, even if Boston hadn't been first. But again, for me, I will temper that expectation, because there are other teams in the league that are playing really well, and over a 7-game series, we never know. Now, having home ice throughout the playoffs should be a really big benefit, especially since Boston's been excellent at home all year, but it doesn't necessarily translate to playoffs either. So, am I optimistic? On some level, sure. When I look at the matchups, the potential matchups in the first round, I don't see a team that I think should be able to knock them out. But I'm saying should be able to because I've watched hockey long enough to know there are no sure things. Getting all those points, not a sure thing. Getting all those wins, still not a sure thing. And even being number one in a bunch of statistical categories. I've done videos before on trophy winners and the fact that very often Stanley Cup champions don't have a lot of trophy winners other than, the Cup trophy and the Conn Smythe. So there's something there as well, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts in the comment section below. What do you expect from Boston in the playoffs? Do you expect a first round exit? Do you expect them to go all the way to the final? Do you expect a Stanley Cup? And I have seen the more points they get, the more I start seeing that, they're going out in the first round. That is absolutely possible. I don't think it happens, but again, being around as long as I have been, and it doesn't feel like it was 4 years ago we saw the Bolts just lose in the first round, but it's been 4 years. And last year's playoffs were relatively easy to predict, and it feels like they were almost too easy to predict. So this year, it could be all over the place. We could see a bunch of upsets, and we're kind of due for them, aren't we? But let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.